Washington state just passed a millionaires tax, a 9.9% tax on household income above $1 million. Supporters say it's overdue economic justice in a state with the worst tax system in America. Critics say it's symbolic politics that could just chase wealth and investment away. As usual, there's truth and distortion on both sides. Business leaders try to stoke fear about taxation without limits, and they hand-wring about economic destruction. Populist politicians, on the other hand, try to tap into very real worries about affordability, but they only offer quick solutions that sound good and don't solve the real problem. Because here's the strange part. The tax doesn't even take effect until 2028, and it won't generate revenue until 2029. So what exactly just happened? Because when you step back and look at Washington state's tax system, it's full of contradictions that should anger liberals and conservatives. We have some of the highest gas taxes in the country. We have a sales tax north of 10% in some counties, and businesses pay a gross receipts tax, meaning they pay tax even when they aren't profitable. Meanwhile, economists consistently rank Washington as one of the most regressive tax systems in the U.S., meaning low-income households pay a much, much larger share of their income in taxes than wealthy households. So the big question isn't just whether a millionaire's tax is a good policy or a half step toward fairness. The bigger question is this. What if the tax system is outdated and ill-designed to serve the needs of a state with a dynamic and diversified economy that has consistently grown its population for decades in spite of its weather? And what if this debate over taxing millionaires, is actually a rare opportunity to rethink the whole system? How does this connect to bigger critiques about the way taxes work in blue states and blue cities on the West Coast and around the country? Today we ask, what if Washington state stepped back from performative politics and took bolder steps to redesign its entire tax system for the modern economy? I'm Greg Ammerfell, and this is Pacific Time, the podcast where we ask the big what-if questions about the future of the West Coast. I'm here in discussion with my co-host, Ashley Brown. Ashley got the ball rolling by laying out the situation in Washington state.
So I'm just going to read a little bit of data to set us up. So this week, the legislature passed a income tax of 9.9% on household incomes over $1 million per year. So I should make sure and stress that's not assets, that's income. It is not going to help the state's $3 billion budget deficit, which we have today. The tax doesn't come into effect until January of 2028, with the first payments due in 2029. So this is a long-term play. As you said, headed to Governor Bob Ferguson's desk. He's expected to sign it. So that could very well have happened by the time this episode comes out. The state estimates that only about 30,000 households in Washington state will actually pay the tax. So that is less than 1%. But it was a pretty close vote in the House, 52 to 46. There were a considerable number of Democrats who voted with the Republicans, 8 of them. And like I said, we face a budget shortfall in the next biennium, 26-27. This doesn't affect that. So it doesn't solve our near-term budget problems. So that's where we are.
Can I ask some clarifying questions just to put some more data on the table? First of all, how big is the Washington state budget?
So Washington budgets in a biennium, so it's a 2-year budget. The current budget is $77 and change billion. And that's going to cover July of 2025 through June of 2027. Going into this budget cycle, Washington faced a $12 to $16 billion budget shortfall. The legislature approved $9 billion in new taxes and reduced spending, which leaves us with a roughly $3 billion hole still to fill, of which the legislature will have to fill at least $1 billion of that next year when they come back in session.
So $77 billion for a population of about 8 million people?
That's right.
So that works out, do my division for me. Does that work out to about $1,000 per person in the budget?
Yeah, I think so.
You hear 77 billion and you think that's massive for a population of 8 million people. And then you hear $1,000 per person for things like infrastructure, things like schools, things like higher education, things like energy. Like it doesn't actually play out to be that much.
I do want to say, just for our listeners who don't live in Washington state, we already have a, a grouping of relatively high taxes. So we have the highest fuel taxes in the country. We have a B&O tax in lieu of a corporate income tax, and that taxes gross receipts, not net income. So small business owners pay a disproportionately high amount of their revenue in B&O tax. We also have a 6.5% statewide sales tax that counties are free to add on to that. King County, obviously largest county in the state, it's where Seattle is, adds another 3.5% to that. And then we don't actually have particularly high property taxes. Our property tax rates land somewhere in the middle,
Hmm.
but our high house values mean that that a lot of Washingtonians pay a lot of dollars in property tax compared to people elsewhere in the US. We
Mhm.
actually end up having the 11th highest property tax burden in the country when we factor in how much we actually pay because of house values.
Yeah, and you're hinting at something else that I think factors into this discussion, which is that the population of Washington State has been growing really steadily for decades. I think it's up something like 30% over the last 20 years. It's still a small population relative to other states at 8 million people. You know, the demand that's put on housing in particular, and in particular in wealthy counties like King County, where we live, is really notable. So that I think figures into this whole discussion about affordability and whether this new set of taxes is about trying to address affordability. But the word I'm dancing around, Ashley, is whether this is a progressive tax reform. And let me explain that. Washington state is considered to have one of the most regressive tax systems, meaning that people in the bottom quartile of income pay over 14, 15% of their total take home in taxes every year because of the sales tax, because of property taxes, because of gas taxes, as compared to people in the top quartile of wealth, the one percenters and down even further, who are paying about 4%. And while that 4% equates to a lot bigger number on an absolute basis, it means that it's by no means fair. Poor people, are paying a much bigger share of their income than very rich people.
We're not one of the most regressive tax systems in the country. Until 2023, we were the worst. It wasn't until 2023 when we passed a capital gains tax, which taxes capital gains over $250,000 a year, that we moved up all of one place. So we are now 49th most regressive. Only Florida is worse. So we've been banging around the bottom for quite a while.
And let's hold that thought around Florida because one argument we're hearing from business and tech leaders is they're like, we'll start moving to places like Florida. So they're after more aggressive tax system, perhaps. We'll come back to
Uh,
that.
Mr. Bezos, Mr. Schultz.
Yes, yes, indeed. We'll talk about Howard and Jeff later. So Ashley, let's talk about the case for these taxes, this so-called millionaires tax. What do you see as the strongest arguments for it?
So I think there's just some equity and structural arguments to be made. You know, if you think about this as less of a individual tax and more of a reform of the system, we are introducing more equity with this tax into our tax system. And the reason for that is there were some things that the legislature did to get the Senate and the governor on side with agreeing to the bill. And it's chiefly two things. A portion of this income tax will go towards expanding childcare and early learning and expanding the child tax credit for working class families. And then a chunk of it is going to go to reducing actually eliminating the B&O tax, the gross receipts tax, for any small business that makes less than $250,000 a year in gross receipts. And that's about 65% of small businesses in Washington state. So
Hmm.
you can argue that a big chunk of this tax revenue is actually going to be redistributed in a relatively equitable way to help small businesses and working families with children.
I also understand that it will go a long way toward plugging the budget gap on K-12 education, which has been perennially underfunded in Washington state and been the subject of some major court battles as a result.
Also, expanding free breakfast and lunch for K through 12 students,
Mhm.
which of course directly impacts child poverty and hunger.
Yeah. I'd elaborate to say, at a time where we're seeing uh, federal budget cuts hit us very directly, particularly around programs in the social safety net related to healthcare, related to free and reduced lunch and nutrition programs. This seems like a move toward Washington State asserting more fiscal sovereignty, even though it may be controversial to do so. It feels like it's in a way been imposed on us by moves in Washington D.C.
Yeah, I think you can say that. I mean, there are also some really interesting and strong cases against this tax and how it will hurt us from a competitive standpoint nationally. But yes, I mean, it is inarguable that we send more dollars to Washington than we get back. And this is going to directly help some of the least wealthy members of our community.
Think for all the discussion about how terrible this state tax might be, the real culprit here is federal tax. And particularly if you're a high earner, your marginal tax rate, I think, is, on the order of 37-40% of your income, not to mention 20% of capital gains on investments. So we can hand wring all we want about, 10% tax on income above $1 million, but DC may have a lot more to do with the pain you feel in taxes.
Well, and we've talked about on this show before the argument of reducing federal tax rates in order to allow states to have the headroom and the muscle to raise progressive revenue on their own, like this tax.
Hmm.
I did not realize the number that overage that we send to Washington, but I think it's interesting that we send to Washington about as much more than we get back as our state budget.
Yeah, let that sink in a minute, would you? Yeah, it's
Yeah.
wild. So in terms of the arguments against this millionaires tax, what does this mean for Washington state competitively? And I would say, just to define the competition, for businesses, Washington sees itself in competition with California, our, state down the coast, with Texas, which is another, kind of major draw of population right now and has a very favorable tax system. And then there are other places. Are there other states or even countries that you see Washington competing with?
Yeah, I mean, I think we compete with Tennessee. I mean,
Mm.
we just saw Starbucks announcing that effectively their HQ2 is moving to Tennessee. Amazon already moved their logistics operation to Tennessee. You and I have had conversations about how that makes actually a lot of sense from a logistics point of view to be not in the upper left corner, but somewhere a little bit more centrally located. Texas for sure. And I would just say the Sun Belt in general, Arizona, Georgia, Florida. Interestingly, there are, I believe, 7 states without an income tax, of which Texas and Tennessee are 2 of them. And
Mhm.
Florida. Florida
Right.
is also without an income tax.
Yeah. So I'll go further on this competitiveness argument because I've seen a lot of tech leaders and business leaders make what I interpret to be kind of a thin argument, or at least they're raising a question that doesn't have a clear answer. And they're saying entrepreneurs and people who've been successful in business have or are getting ready to leave Washington because they worry about this tax situation. And they hold up the examples of Jeff Bezos leaving his house, leaving his house in Bellevue, Washington for Florida. They hold up Howard Schultz deciding to move to Florida. I think you're hearing the venture community say that some founders are saying they're not sure Washington State's a good place to build anymore. What's your take on that, Ashley?
You certainly see that anecdotally. Before we started recording, you and I had a discussion that we've both founded companies here.
Hmm.
And at no point in my decision to found a company was my marginal tax rate a factor. What factors to me is the community here, the community of founders here, the support that you get from the community, obviously where are potential funders, and the broader just sort of founder environment. I never once thought about my personal marginal tax rate. And in fact, had I been fortunate enough to make more than $1 million a year from my startup, I feel like I would have said thank you,
Mhm.
Seattle, for creating an environment where I could build that business. I did pull some data for you. The Washington Policy Institute says that high earners do respond to tax differentials, but they tend to be those with a high amount of investment income or weaker local ties. And they found that that elasticity is less than 1%. It's 0.1% they found in the study. I would also point out that Howard and Jeff are retired. They're
Right.
not building a company.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, it struck me as kind of funny to say to, hold them up as examples of what of capital flight from Washington when I think the story of rich people making it big in the big northern cities and fleeing to, Florida or Palm Springs or Arizona is as old as capitalism. So I don't think there's a lot that we can interpret from that. Nor do I think there's a lot we can interpret from companies like Starbucks or Microsoft or Amazon building big operations in places outside of their home state because it's just the way big companies that are mature and global tend to operate. You hinted at something before that I think is super important to underscore because our headlines are so dominated by the major corporations, the Microsofts, the Amazons, the Googles, the Open AIs, the NVIDIAs. And yet, most of employment, most of the economy is driven by small businesses. And so the idea that the small business would actually get more favorable tax treatment under this
Yeah.
new proposal in Washington seems like it's really worth highlighting. That it's a better place for a mom and pop grocery store or a dry cleaner or an insurance broker to operate or could be than it was a few years ago. So I think that's also worth highlighting.
It's also really important to remember the B&O taxes hit all businesses. The tax relief that's built into the bill eliminates it for businesses making less than $650,000. Sorry, excuse me, $250,000 a year. That could also be a startup, like a
Mhm.
very early stage startup. So, um, which has revenue that is largely running off, let's say, investment dollars. That's taxes that they would have to pay out of money that they've raised that they won't have to pay now.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I don't know about you, but in my startup experience, getting to $1 million a year of income was always a dream, but never a reality.
I do think there's an added argument. Like, I did also find some polling data for you that found that almost half of business leaders in Washington, 44%, said that they were considering moving out of the state because of the tax. I would argue that to pick up and move your whole life in your business is a really big deal. And so it's very easy to respond in a poll, yes, I think I'm going to move, but it's the data also shows it's a very different thing to actually do it. Like, less than 1% of them will actually do it.
Yeah, and it's interesting to me. I mean, some of the very same business leaders who you hear just championing Seattle and Washington State because it's got this base of really dynamic, interesting companies. It's got the University of Washington. It's got momentum in terms of population growth. At one point, a few years ago, there were more construction cranes in the Seattle skyline than any other city in the world. The people that are crowing about that are now the ones saying, "Oh my gosh, woe is me! The sky is falling. Washington State will never be the same." And it strikes me as disingenuous and also lacking. I think Washington often has a chip on its shoulder as compared to California, but I'm detecting that in particular right now. It's like, oh, we can't compete with the sunshine if our tax rates are a little bit closer. And it's like, but we can compete with clean air. We can compete with plentiful energy. We can compete with beautiful trees and mountainous landscapes and the views of three national parks from our downtown. Like, am I giving fair assessment of the argument from these tech and business leaders?
I think your assessment's fair. I think you are potentially not giving enough credence to some very real concerns that they have, which is we are already a very highly taxed state. We also have an estate tax, which we haven't touched on. This is something founders think about a lot. If they have a successful business, they obviously want to pass it on. We have by far the highest estate tax in the country. It's 35%. We're also considering a statewide payroll tax, and also proponents of this millionaires tax, as it's being called, don't really have a good answer when you remind them that it's unconstitutional. It's not even a law yet, and I guarantee you litigation is coming.
Yeah, I hear you on the litigation. I was just going to ask you to pause and explain the constitutionality of this millionaires tax.
Yeah. So in 1934, there was a court case, Supreme Court case here in Washington, where in a very narrow decision, it was a 5-4 decision, the Washington Supreme Court found that the income tax, which had passed in a referendum, was unconstitutional because the Constitution requires taxes to be applied evenly, and a graduated income tax they held violated that provision of the Constitution. We, being residents of Washington, have subsequently voted on the income tax and rejected it 10 times since the 1930s. The most recent was in 2010, when a constitutional amendment that would have allowed a graduated income tax on incomes above 250,000 was rejected by roughly a two-thirds majority.
So the state constitution doesn't allow for a variable tax, and it's proved very unpopular, is what I hear you saying. How can proponents justify what they're putting forward?
Well, I mean, I think proponents of the tax would say it is technically an excise tax on the receipt of income. It's a very nuanced, complicated legal argument, and I'm not a lawyer, so I can't go into it any more than that. I'm just telling you what they say. And then it's only going to affect 30,000 households, but it will raise $3 billion in revenue. And the equitable redistributive elements of the tax are broadly good for the state as a whole.
Yeah.
I think that is the argument that they would make.
Yes, and the other things I've heard, Ashley, are to do with the fact that when the capital gains tax passed, it did go to court, and the courts upheld it. So there is recent precedent for some construct like what we're talking about here. And you're right, calling it an excise tax is a framing only a lawyer could love, and lawyers are going to continue to love it as the lawsuits pile up around this. The other thing I think is worth considering here is not just the policy, but the politics. And clearly, Bob Ferguson and the democratically controlled legislature in Washington State are reading the room and noting that affordability is a very real issue. It may have been very responsible for getting Donald Trump elected. It is also featuring in a lot of Democratic campaigns now in the face of Trump's offensive governance, to be blunt about it. But what I think people are saying is there is a sense that policies that soak the rich are worth pursuing right now. And so they're taking advantage of this moment to do something that, while not perfect, does feel like it's more fair to the vast majority of the electorate.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think there's also no one in the legislature was alive when this Supreme Court case was decided. We also elect our Supreme Court judges here in Washington. So I think that there's probably a belief that, if this case were to reach the Supreme Court again, they may decide it differently. It was very narrowly decided the first time around. And so I think there's that too. That there's a belief that we're just in a much more favorable policy environment in this era than we have probably been in the last decade to 2 decades.
Yeah, interesting. I mean, just to thicken the plot too. It is interesting. Certainly in the over 20 years I've lived in Seattle, it's rare to think about a state levy that hasn't been passed. So people's attitudes are not anti-state or tax. They consistently vote for things that are built into their property tax or built into their car tabs or other things in order to fund schools, in order to fund transit, in order to fund road reconstruction. So it seems to have just operated in a very different way than we see in states with more income tax.
I think what makes income tax such a third rail for the electorate is that they do not trust politicians in Olympia to use the tax revenues appropriately and reduce consumption taxes, which hit everyone and are incredibly regressive.
Hmm.
And, I think that there's just a broad based belief that Olympia is addicted to increased spending without thinking about the revenue element. So I'll give you some data on that. because I pulled it before we started recording. In the last 10 years, so 2015 to 2025, the population grew by just under 14%. In that time, we had 35% inflation. So, the COVID years in particular fall in that time. Tax revenue has increased basically 100%. So it's up 99%. Legislature has found ways to double tax revenue. Spending has gone up 116%.
Mm.
So spending is outpacing population growth by roughly X. And you could see this in the Republican argument against the bill in the legislature. They explicitly said the income tax is going to start at $1 million now, but that threshold will go down. And then you see people in their mind saying, "All right, I'm about to get hit with a 10% state income tax," which, by the way, would be one of the highest in the country, and I'm still paying 6.5% minimum state income tax. I'm still paying the 11th highest property taxes in the country, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah. So there is a credibility crisis for government in Washington State. And by the way, I hear the same kinds of discussions going on about California, where I grew up and which I've been tracking more closely in the last year. You know, that California is perceived as this very highly taxed state, and on some level that is true, but it's also kind of a misperception because it's focused on very progressive tax system and the rate at which the highest earners in California are taxed at about 14.5%. And so, you hear Gavin Newsom, Governor Gavin Newsom talking a lot about how poorly understood the California tax systems are, and yet the same charges are leveled. That for all the revenue that California takes in, how what is the ROI for the average citizen? It's very hard. It's very hard to judge.
Well, I mean, except, the data shows that Californians, vis-a-vis other Americans, live pretty good lives
Hmm.
in terms of health outcomes, access to education, child poverty, on a broad range of measures. California is one of the best places in the country to live. So you could argue those progressive taxes actually do deliver.
Yeah, I mean, back to Washington State for a minute. I mean, the numbers you cited about the rate at which tax revenue and spending have outpaced population growth are really alarming. And yet, I'll raise some questions. Like, was there a backlog of infrastructure investment that we've had to catch up to? I noticed our roads in Washington State, by and large, are nowhere close to as good as the roads you find in California. I noticed that the cost of living in Seattle and many of our cities in Washington State has really climbed over the last 10 to 20 years. And so do firefighters and police officers and teachers, are they keeping up with that? And so, are the public employee unions right to be advocating for big increases in order to just help their members get paid and live?
Yes, there's undoubtedly some of that. Obviously, I also will remind everyone COVID fell in that period as well. So, I mean, which was a cataclysm for our economy along with everyone else's. But the legislature also is sort of addicted to runaway spending. I looked this up too, to figure out when we sort of broke the proverbial bank. It turns out in 2021 we didn't have a budget shortfall at all, and the legislature still emptied the rainy day fund by $2 billion to fund additional spending. Then in 2022 they went back to the ATM. We had a $14 billion revenue surplus in 2022, which was, by the way, the highest in Washington state history. Um, and the legislature directed 80% of that budget surplus to new spending. And that had the effect of growing the budget by 20% in just 2 years. So that locks in, beginning in 2021, 2022, a much higher baseline than we had ever had before as a state. And this biennium, the 23 to 25 biennium, is where the math breaks.
Ashley, you point out that the math breaks. Are we doomed, or does this highlight how desperately we need not just a higher tax for a small percentage of people, but a rethinking of the way taxes work in this state? You, I think, have educated me that The issue in Washington may not be the amount of tax dollars we raise, it's that the system is highly unstable when we're dependent on property tax and sales tax. And so you end up with shortfalls and gaps, and add on to it the sort of uncertainty of federal spending. It puts a state with a tax system like ours in a really precarious state fairly often. On top of the fact that you have, a Democratic governor, a Democratic Senate, and a Democratic House that have no one seriously opposing their moves and trying to contain their worst impulses around spending. Where do you think things go?
Well, I mean, I think unless we have structural tax reform, we're completely fucked because Washingtonians never met a social program they didn't love, and yet they don't want to pay any taxes for it. I think that this millionaire's tax is simply a populist gotcha by the legislature to kick the can down the road for 2 more years. By the way, it doesn't take effect until you won't be writing your first checks to the government until after the next election, which I found that timing interesting. But it doesn't solve the problem. You know, soaking 30,000 households is not going to fix the structural revenue problem we have in this state. What we need to do, in my opinion, is do the hard thing, which is change the Constitution or get a more favorable court ruling, implement a sensible graduated income tax. Most states have them. If most states have them, and if you calibrate the tax rates accordingly, you don't have the competitiveness problem to worry about. And then lower consumption taxes, which hit poor Washingtonians the hardest and are the source of our regressive system. We've talked on this podcast about putting the progress back in progressive is true progress. This is not progress.
What is it then?
Like I said, I think it's kicking the can down the road. I think it's doing something that is popular on paper and in the news, which is soaking the rich. I think it, to your point, is informed by the populist lean of the state in the last election cycle or two. But this is not good policy.
Yeah, the intersection of politics and policy are always so interesting. I mean, I'm wondering if there's some evil genius in Bob Ferguson's embrace of this tax as a way to just create momentum towards some bigger set of tax reforms. That if you don't like what you're seeing here, then advocate for a system overhaul that is about graduated income tax that envisions fairness, that puts progressive tax structure on the table and gets rid of the consumption taxes like the sales tax. Maybe not gets rid of them, but minimizes sales tax, fuel tax, B&O tax on businesses, et cetera, and gets us to a place that's predictable. Because it turns out if you're a business operating in Washington State, the up and downness is what's hard to manage. When you know what it's going to be, you can plan for it and build your business accordingly. When you're a household, you can plan around something predictable. Right now, it just seems unpredictable. So it feels like Ferguson may be taking advantage of the moment to just move us in the direction of a serious discussion and debate about the tax system we want in the state.
So if you're right, that means that the governor is doing exactly what the Republican leader in the Senate said they were doing, which is the $1 million millionaires tax is the Trojan horse. The floor will eventually go down to ensnare all of us. And we have to hope that the legislature will reduce consumption taxes rather than saying something to the effect of, all right, we're going to change the Constitution to allow an income tax, but we're also going to put restrictions or breaks in that same legislation to ensure consumption taxes fall. So we're not doing that. And instead, we're going to do exactly what the Republican leader in the Senate said that they were doing.
Yeah, and I mean, I think you and I actually agree that what we're after here is a grand bargain in Washington State around taxes that have a graduated income tax, but do away with some of the consumption taxes that that place an undue burden on the poorer households in the state.
Yeah.
And by the way, raise tax revenue because this state is growing and this state's ambitious. Like there are a lot, the tech boom of the last 20 years has drawn in a lot of people who have really exciting ideas. And so, how do you keep up and make sure your schools become some of the best in the country? How do you make sure your transit system and your roads work and make sure that people can get to where they need to be on time? And so I feel like that's got to be part of the discussion. And right now, it seems like it's a debate that's sort of not mired in vision; it's mired in fear.
Yeah, and the data that I went through earlier, um, it's easy to skip over how swingy revenue numbers are. Like, remember, in 2022, we had a $14 billion surplus, and in 2025, we have a 14, almost $15 billion deficit. How do you plan as a state that has a biennial budget of $77 billion when you have $30 billion swings in revenue?
The answer is I have no idea. I don't think you
Yeah,
can.
yeah. No, it leads you to drain the rainy day fund regularly, which is not the intent, obviously.
Right. So let's see if we can put a point on some of these things. I mean, if you were to kind of highlight the tensions that are being surfaced in this discussion right now in Washington State, but that come up in the debates in Oregon and California and really all over the country whenever we're talking about taxes. What's going on?
Well, I think that there is a very real fear that soaking the rich is going to kill the goose that laid the golden egg. That the very things that attract people to our gray, rainy, yet beautiful part of the world, if those things go away, i.e., relatively, well, no taxes on income, historically low taxes on capital gains and estates, if that all goes away, that those people will just choose to build their companies somewhere else and will turn into the next Cleveland or Detroit. I think that's probably, I would argue, the biggest argument right now or concern. And then I think there's just a small d democratic argument to be made, which is, voters have rejected this 10 times and it is on its face unconstitutional. Why do politicians keep swinging at this pinata rather than sitting down and actually having a genuine reform conversation that puts the state on just a much more sound financial footing long term going forward?
Yeah, and I'll underscore a couple other points that I think you've made well, which are that uh, this is a mirage because it doesn't actually go into effect until 28, 29, and so we're having this debate right now, and it's going to have no impact for quite some time. And I find it shocking and sort of sad that it's beyond the point of the next election cycle in this state and the next really presidential election cycle as well. Um, and I think you've also highlighted given this is in a legal gray area, we're going to see all kinds of lawsuits around this. We're going to see voter initiatives. All it's done is toss the ball in the air. There's been a jump ball. The game has now started, and we'll see where it goes.
You haven't said what you think about it.
I mean, I think in speculating that there's some evil genius here, I think the governor and the legislature have taken advantage of the moment to move toward a more progressive tax position that is going to be popular with a lot of voters if they're not persuaded by very cynical bumper stickers from business and tech elites. And that the game is just getting started. There could be a window in the next few years to make the case for real comprehensive tax reform in Washington. And I think we're going to see the same kinds of discussions in a lot of blue states and blue cities. I'm encouraged by what I'm seeing from Zoran Mondani and from Katie Wilson and Daniel Lurie, and other mayors in big blue cities who seem to recognize that the Democratic Party has an effectiveness problem, and they're going to show up with progressive ideas, but they're going to also be effective implementers, and they're going to have to get serious about the way revenue flows and the way budgets get handled and get more transparent with that. So think we're I think we're maybe at the dawn of a really interesting change in tides for governance. And I was thinking about this just this morning that there was some great reporting or provocative reporting done about how city halls and school boards have been run by Republicans in a lot of parts of the country, but kind of Republicans in the George Bush mold, not the Donald Trump mold. And effectiveness was kind of owned by the local Republican Party. I think MAGA and Trump are going to make that a very difficult position for those local Republicans to hold, and there's a huge opportunity for Democrats to step into the breach and to own the center and to own effectiveness and making the government work better for the people.
I mean, I guess the silver lining here is everyone seems to acknowledge that the status quo cannot continue and that we need to do something.
What's the phrase that gets associated with Trump? FAFO, fuck around and find out. It feels like while I often disregard or am really turned off by the kinds of things the Trump administration does, that governing philosophy I think is kind of interesting. And in a way, it's an adoption of, Silicon Valley mentality around move fast and break things. Government needs to be bolder and more risk taking if we're going to actually try and solve problems. So maybe that's what's happening here.
Well, and the Democrats and the governor might also find out that there are more people in Washington state than they think who envision themselves making more than $1 million one day.
I think that is a really important point. It's the same appeal as the lottery, right? Even though it's without a doubt a terrible economic decision for anyone to buy a single lottery ticket, buying the dream of, a $1 million payout or an $100 million payout is worth something to people. So the idea of a tax system that taxes, only 30,000 households in Washington state might be offensive to someone who imagines or hopes that they could be inside of that 30,000 person group.
Do you not see how a tax that more or less surgically impacts just 30,000 households could be democratically unfair?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting to think. I mean, what the Washington State Constitution and the courts have said is that if there's a tax levied, it has to be done evenly. And I think the argument for a flat tax is a easy to explain uh, and easy to implement, and also fair and democratic. And that 10%, if you're making $50,000, we can all recognize paying $5,000 on $50,000 of income is a lot, but that's reasonable if someone making $500,000 is paying 50. So I think the idea of a flat tax is something that needs to be considered, but it needs to be considered in the context of doing away with consumption taxes as well.
There's just something about crafting a policy that sort of surgically targets fewer people than could fit into a stadium seems punitive by the government. And I understand these are people who are making a lot of money, but that doesn't mean that they don't deserve a fair shake from their government too.
But by that measure, do you argue against a graduated income tax?
No, I think again, like I argued, I think we should start over and have an income tax that applies to broadly. Let's I will acknowledge that we would exempt some level of income
Mhm,
for the very poor, but that everyone pays
mhm.
at some level. State income taxes in general are graduated, but they're graduated within fairly narrow bands. It's not like the federal system where the bands are quite large. State income taxes tend to exist within a fairly narrow range.
But I find it I mean, I hear your point, and yet I find it so interesting. I mean, looking at the tax reforms that the second Trump administration advocated and got through Congress, it created the most favorable conditions for the wealthiest people. That's where it started. That was its design point, that it was about a reformulation of trickle down economics, which are shown to have failed. So the idea that
I'm not arguing those were great either.
no, I know you're not, but I would say rhetorically, it's interesting to start from the opposite perspective. Like, what if we do surgically target the wealthiest because they're the ones that can most afford it, and it's really just given the amount of taxation that low income people are already facing, this is just about tipping the balance a little bit so that affluent people are paying more of their fair share.
But right now they're paying the entire share.
Because you're saying that even though their effective rate is 4%, they still represent 60% of total tax revenue?
Well, in the sense that they're going to be the only people paying this excise tax on income receipts.
Mhm. Yeah, it's also worth understanding that when you talk about a number as small as 30,000, that tax accountants and financial planners are having a field day right now, helping people think about how to quote unquote redomicile, meaning moving the home base of their money. and how to estate plan in a way that moves their money out of Washington state as well. So, uh, you know, that's that is, I think, an argument in your favor here that it is surgically targeted, and the people that are being targeted have the means to evade those taxes.
Yeah, and we did hear similar. In fairness, we did hear similar arguments about the capital gains tax that
Hmm.
passed. It turns out the flight did not happen, and that capital gains tax actually collected significantly more revenue than it was projected to. Partially because the stock market has been on a tear since that capital gains tax passed. But I think there is something to be said for if you were targeting 30,000 people or 30,000 households, I should say, those households have the means, really do have the means to up sticks and move somewhere else.
Hmm. Or to just buy another house somewhere else and spend
Correct.
enough less time in Washington that
That's right.
they don't pay the tax. Yeah, yeah.
Whereas I would argue that if we had a broad-based graduated income tax, those 30,000 households might still be paying 9.9%. But if everyone was paying, I would guess less likely that they would do that.
On a show that's about what if questions, Ashley, what I hear you asking is, what if we moved toward a more reasonable state income tax system that was based on a change to the state constitution, and in the process got rid of silly consumption taxes that inordinately affect the poor? Could all of us, the affluent and the poorest among us in Washington state, get behind that? And is that a model for the way other West Coast states might operate?
I I just think that we're blithely skipping past a incredible opportunity where everyone acknowledges the current system is broken. We live in, I believe we're now the fourth richest state in the country, and we have an incredibly vibrant economy. And we have the opportunity here to do something different. The tragedy, as I see it, isn't that we've done badly. It's that we just could be doing so much better.
Before we wrap up, let's zoom out. The conversation started with a single policy change, Washington's new millionaires tax. But what we discovered pretty quickly is that the real story isn't about one tax. It's about the structure of the whole system. First, there's the equity argument. Washington has long been one of the most regressive tax systems in the country, meaning lower income households pay a much larger share of their income in taxes than wealthier households. Supporters of this new tax say it begins to rebalance that system, funding childcare, school meals, and reducing taxes for small businesses. Great. But second, there's this competitiveness concern. When you design a tax aimed at just 30,000 households, those households often have the resources to enlist the accounting and legal advice that helps them avoid the tax altogether. Which raises the obvious question: does a tax focused just on millionaires actually solve the structural problem? And that leads to the third and biggest idea we discussed today. What if Washington stopped patching the system and redesigned it entirely? What if instead of relying so heavily on sales tax, gas taxes, and gross receipts taxes on business, the kinds that fall hardest on working families and small businesses, the state did the hard work to modernize its constitution and adopted a modern, broad-based income tax and struck a grand bargain with voters by cutting the taxes that fuel unfairness? In other words, what if this debate isn't really about soaking the rich, but about building a smarter tax system for a modern West Coast economy? That's a conversation Washington hasn't fully had yet, but it may be the one that matters most. If you enjoyed this episode, please follow Pacific Time Podcast on your favorite podcast platform, share it with a friend, and leave us a review. It really helps people find the show. And if you want to keep the conversation going, subscribe to @Pacific Time Podcast on Substack and share your thoughts on the what if questions we're asking about the future of the West Coast. I'm Greg Ammerfell here with Ashley Brown. Thanks for being with us in Pacific Time. We'll see you next time.